Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about the historiography of Genesis 1 through 11 and how this relates to a lot of other archaeological finds that have been found in the ancient Near East and how these inform how we understand Genesis 1 through 11. The first question to answer is really, what is historiography? Fundamentally, historiography is the study of historical writings. Now, the historiography is not really trying to look at the historical facts as much as it is trying to understand the nature of the writing itself. And it's trying to answer questions like, what kind of literary genre is a particular document? What is the author trying to communicate with what's in the document? What are the ideas that are communicated in the document in light of other similar documents? How do we categorize and classify these things, and so on? That's what historiography is concerned with. Most of the conversation for Genesis 1 through 11 gets wrapped up in historicity, and this is the study of historical authenticity. And while we're not going to be looking at this in depth, I want to focus on historiography because it's often overlooked, and I think there are a lot of things that historiography can teach us about what we understand about Genesis 1 through 11, and it will help also inform how we see the historicity of Genesis 1 through 11 as well. You may be asking, why should I study the historiography of Genesis 1 through 11? Well, there's a lot of reasons that we need to look at this, because in the biblical record, Genesis 1 through 11 really does stand out. It covers about 2,000 years of history, even by the most conservative estimates. If we were to take these timelines that have been produced by some of these organizations like Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministries, they will typically place about 2,000 years of history before Abraham. So if we had a timeline, you would have creation on the left, and then you would have the flood and Babel, and then Abraham in the middle of that timeline. And then after Abraham, you would have the Exodus, David, the exile, and Jesus in Revelation. So Abraham represents about the middle of the history covered in the Bible. So what you have then is Genesis 1 through 11 covering about 50% of the history in the Bible. So about 1% of the Bible is dedicated to about 50% of the history, and the other 50% is covered by Genesis 12 through the end of Revelation. It's about 99% of the Bible. So you can see how Genesis 1 through 11 already stands out in terms of history and how much history is covered in such a compressed time frame in the early chapters of Genesis. The other difference that Genesis 1 through 11 has is that it contains macroscopic world-shaping events, while Genesis 12 really zooms in on Abraham and his descendants. So these world-shaping events kind of give it the scope that it is talking about things that are global or universal in their scope, while Genesis is really zooming in on a particular man and his descendants. Although the events of Abraham do have global implications ultimately when you get to Jesus, the nature of these events and these narratives are really focused in on a very small scope, while everything before that is really dealing with world-shaping events, where we have the creation of the world, we have the judging of the world, and we have the creation of nations in Babel. And then we get to Genesis 12, and then we get the story of a man and his wife and his descendants ultimately. So again, this is another reason to look at the historiography of Genesis 1 through 11, because it does stand out in terms of how we see it in the grand scheme of history as it's unveiled in Genesis. In addition to the biblical reasons for looking at the historiography of Genesis 1 through 11, there are archaeological reasons as well. There's never been a direct confirmation of any of the events of Genesis 1 through 11. There have been archaeological finds that might hint at some of these things, but never a direct discovery that would confirm any of the events that we've read about in Genesis 1 through 11. In other words, they haven't found Noah's Ark, or they haven't found the Tower of Babel or something like that. What they do have, though, are the other creation myths from other cultures that have remarkable similarities to Genesis 1 through 11. And these myths, as we see them, have these remarkable similarities, but there's also a number of differences. So when we have these other archaeological finds, it's important to try to understand Genesis 1 through 11 in light of these other worldviews that are going on around the Jews as they are coming up as a country and as their history unfolds. It's important to understand what they were up against in terms of other deities and other religions, and we can look at these other myths in light of Genesis 1 through 11 and then see their similarities and see their differences, and then make some really pretty astounding observations concerning these archaeological findings that have been discovered. You heard me mention myth on the last slide. Now, we might be thinking, am I going to call Genesis 1 through 11 myth? Well, yes, but not in the colloquial understanding of the word myth. A myth is typically understood to be an account that's not true or an untrue story. Well, that's not what I'm talking about, is not an untrue story. Rather, I'm talking about the literary genre that Genesis 1 through 11 would fall into if you were analyzing it as a historiographer would do. And mythology is really a literary genre that is trying to explain something about the world. That's fundamentally what mythology is. So when we look at the Genesis 1 through 11 account, that's really what it's documenting, is the unfolding of the world, the creation of the world, how we got language, how we got sin, where did people come from, all these kinds of worldview questions that mythology attempts to answer. And as a literary genre, we see this in virtually every culture that we know to exist. But that's not to say that Genesis 1 through 11 is not history. When we think about Genesis 1 through 11, it follows a pattern that we find elsewhere in the scriptures. It's called the Wav narrative structure, or the Vav consecutive narrative structure. And this is a structure that is used by the Hebrews and the scribes to document historical events. And the structure of Genesis follows that same structure that we find in books like Kings and Chronicles, where they have history and it being told as a narrative format. And Genesis 1 through 11 follows that same narrative format. So what we can say then is that the author intended it to be historical. And with that in mind, being that we believe that the Bible is an accurate record of God's work in the world, we would call it a so-called true myth, if you will. It is true, but it's a myth in the terms of mythological genre of literature, not in the colloquial understanding of the word that is typically thrown around when we talk about myths in general. And philologists like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis use this same kind of idea of true myth to describe the story of Jesus. Whenever we look at the historicity of Jesus, they see that it has mythological elements to it, but it's not myth in the sense that it's untrue. They believe it that's true, and Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. The same could be said for Genesis 1 through 11. We see this as a true myth. It's not us telling a fantasy, it's telling a true account of what happened, but it does fall into a genre of literature that we might call myth or mythology. So within the study of mythology, there is a kind of myth called a creation myth, or creation myths, really plural. And these categories are the category of myths that these fall under is called etiology, and it's basically an explanation of where things come from, or an explanation of origins that myths attempt to answer. And within etiology, there are really kind of three subpoints that we can really look at. The first is cosmogony. Now, cosmogony is where did the world come from? And it's dealing with where did all the places that we see around us, where did the land itself come from, where did the plants and animals come from, and things like that. That's what cosmogony is dealing with. Second, you have theogony. Theogony are where did the gods come from. And in creation myths, you see the gods created in some way, shape, form, or fashion. Now, we assume in Christian thought that there is no theogony. Now, this is a pretty significant point. When we look at these other creation myths, you'll see that their gods are emerging from something. And while the God of the Hebrews didn't do that, he always existed and brought the other things into existence. So theogony is one of those questions that creation myths attempt to answer. And third, there's anthropogeny, and that's where did man come from? And almost all of these myths have some kind of explanation of how man was created. Now, they'll vary in the details, but these kind of three things are really what these ideological myths or creation myths are really trying to get at whenever we look at them in the context of whatever culture that they're a part of. In the ancient Near East, there are three areas or three regions that have implications on the Hebrew thought. And the reason why is the Hebrew people claim heritage in three different regions within ancient Near East. One would be Egypt, the other would be Canaan, and the other being Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is where Abraham came from, and it's also where the Jews were exiled in the exile period, the exilic period, whenever they were sent away from Canaan after the Babylonian conquest. So they were exposed to the thought patterns of the ancient Mesopotamian people in that region, and that's why it's important to look at things from that area of the world. Second, we know that they did a sojourn in Egypt, and this is where Moses was brought up, and he was raised in the royal courts of the Pharaoh, so he would have had an Egyptian education as well as an education of his own people. So he was definitely influenced by Egyptian thought in his writings. That's not to say that he used that in the formulation of the law, but it is important to recognize that he did have this as a backdrop whenever he was leading his people out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. And then obviously Canaan would be very important as well, because this is where the Israelites settled and stood up their kingdom and lived for many generations and hundreds of years. And they had a lot of history in that part of the world as well. So these three regions have influences on the Hebrew thought, and then they also have influences on what the Hebrews were really up against in terms of other competing religious worldviews that were in the time and space that the Hebrews existed in the ancient Near East. Let's zoom in on ancient Egypt and look at some of the archaeological findings that have informed how we understand the worldviews of the ancient Egyptian people and some of their creation myths. The first one that was found is at Heliopolis. Now, Heliopolis has the story of a god named Atum and a primal earth that emerges from a primal sea. Atum then creates the other gods, and he also creates the air, and then the other gods are responsible for the subsequent creation after that. Now, there's some parallels here that we can see with the creation in Genesis. We see a primal sea. We see a hill emerging from that primal sea. And then you have a creation of the air, or really the heavens in this respect. So there's some parallels here with Genesis that we can look at, and we'll analyze this a little while. The second finding that they have in Egypt was from Memphis, and Memphis was a very important city in Egypt, and it's very similar to the Heliopolis myth, but the difference is that the god is named Ptah. He's really an analog to Atum, and what Ptah does is he creates the world by a thought, while Atum really did an act of a physical bodily act to bring about the world. Ptah does it by thought. Now, the similarities here with the Genesis account is in Genesis we see God bringing about the world and all that's in it by speaking it into existence. It's a speech act that God has, and while Atum does it with a thought. Now, this is significant, or Ptah does it with a thought. This is significant because it's more closely analogous to what we see in Genesis. And then the third place that they found something was in Hermopolis, and this myth was again similar to the other two, but the difference here is instead of one god bringing other gods into existence, you have these primal gods that are each a male-female pair, and so you have 8 gods and 4 pairs, and each one of these is a personified aspect of the primal state. You have the sea, the water, the darkness, and the formlessness, and these four aspects are seen in the Genesis 1 account as well. You have a sea, you have that's full of water, and then you have darkness, and you have formlessness. And this primal state composes where the rest of the world was brought from. So in a creative act, these gods bring about the world as they know it. These kind of primal gods that emerged more into more personified deities at some later point. But the key thing to hear is to see the sea, the water, the darkness, and the formlessness in this primal state that's also reflected in Genesis 1 as well. Let's zoom out now and talk about the other creation myths that are found in Canaan and Mesopotamia. I want to first talk about the one that was found in Canaan that archaeologists found at the Ugarit site. And this is sometimes called the Ugaritic creation myth, and it's very similar to many of the other ones in the Egyptian accounts as well as Mesopotamian accounts, where you have a primal sea covered by darkness and a non-sentient wind. And from this, in essence, if you will, to say it was a full-blown being would be an overstatement. It's more of an essence that starts to move things around, and then from this primal sea emerge the first gods, and then the gods then divide the waters, and there's a struggle amongst the gods with the other gods and against the waters. So the gods make new gods, and the second generation gods rebel against the primal gods. And after that, the second generation gods are victorious. They end up dividing the sea and creating the lands, plants, animals, and ultimately man. So there's some obvious parallels here with the Genesis 1 accounts. You see a primal sea again covered in darkness, and the gods emerging from this is not something you find in Genesis 1, but you do see the gods dividing the sea to create the lands, plants, animals, and man. So within this Ugaritic myth, we do see some similarities with what we see in the Genesis 1 account as well. With the Babylonian myths, there's a couple I want to talk about here. The first is one called Enuma Elish, and this is a set of tablets that details the emergence of the primal gods from a primordial sea. Again, we've seen this theme already. These gods create the winds and other gods, and again, we see the second generation gods doing battle against the first generation gods, and then they subdued the wind. The god Marduk emerges as triumphant. He becomes the chief god, and then he ends up creating the world and man. So this creation myth of Enuma Elish, again, has that primal sea, some primal gods, and then they emerge from that. Then you have a god creating out of this primal state the world and man as they understood it. So the other myths that are from the Sumerian context or the Mesopotamian context that are also very similar to what we find in the early chapters of Genesis would be one called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this myth is very popular. It's probably the most well-known of these myths in most popular circles, because it does have a analog to the flood narratives that we see. It's a well-known Babylonian myth that has been retold. So there's a number of versions of it. There's a lot to the myth that isn't talked about, but there's one tablet that does mention a flood, and there are some analogs to it that we see accounted for in the account of Noah. And in this particular myth, Utnapishtim builds a boat. He's a hero. He's a character in the story who builds a boat, and he's told to bring along his family to escape a flood. And then the boat comes to rest on a mountaintop where he releases birds, and they bring back things to the boat. And there's some obvious parallels there with Noah and Noah's Ark. The difference, though, is that in this case, the character is trying to escape a god of mischief. The god is using flood to bring about chaos into the world versus Noah, which we see as a the flood is as judgment against sin. So there's some differences there. Plus, the Epic of Gilgamesh is more of a local flood, and then most would hold that the flood in Noah's context is a global flood. So there's some distinctions there that need to be made between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood narrative there, and the Noah account that's found in the book of Genesis. Another important find that was found in Mesopotamia is another creation and flood myth called Atra-Hasis. And this one details creation and flood. The creation myth doesn't have details about the nature of the world being created, but it does have man being created. And these were men being created as replacements for lesser gods who had refused to work for the greater gods. The greater gods were then looking for a replacement, essentially a slave labor force to do their work for them. And they end up, the lesser gods end up rebelling. They end up being destroyed. The gods create the men, and men then do the bidding of the greater gods. And then what happens is the earth becomes overpopulated, and then the god Enki, this is the same god that we see in the Epic of Gilgamesh, wipes out humanity and save a few people who survive on a boat. That's exactly what happens in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's widely accepted that the Epic of Gilgamesh borrowed its flood account from Atra-Hasis, the account of creation, and incorporates that into the Epic of Gilgamesh. And again, we see some similarities with the flood narrative here, with a family being saved on a boat, landing on a mountain, and birds bringing back objects to the boat. But again, the same differences here apply to the Epic of Gilgamesh, where you have a god of mischief bringing about reintroducing chaos into the world by way of a flood, while in the Genesis account, the flood is used as judgment against the world for sin. There's a lot of common traits that we can talk about among the 7 myths that we just looked at from ancient Egypt, ancient Canaan, and ancient Mesopotamia. We see earth and gods emerging from primal seas, and this is pretty significant because the gods and the earth are coming from the seas, or they are almost in a way personifications in some aspects of these seas. Second, there's a struggle between gods and chaos and gods and other gods. In the ancient Near Eastern worldviews of that time, the ability to hold off chaos and bring order to the world was seen as a creative act. So to name something was to give it purpose, or to give something order was to give it purpose. And that was the idea that they had, that something didn't exist until it had some kind of name or purpose assigned to it. So the struggle is against the chaos that was in the primal state to bring about the order that was in the world. And the other times we see gods against other gods. So we see many cases you have second generation gods fighting against first generation gods, and then the second generation gods become the gods of particular nations and so on, where you have more chief deities. And usually these second generation gods are the ones that bring about the created world as they see it, in terms of bringing about land, plants, animals, and ultimately man. Likewise, man is almost always created last. The world is almost always created first, the world that is the land, and then the plants, animals, and things in the world, and then man is created as a last creative act by the gods. Now, the man in most of these accounts is not created in the image of God, but they are created to do the bidding of the gods. And in many cases, if you read further into some of these other mythologies, men end up rebelling against the gods as a struggle. A fourth aspect is that the creation itself is personified in many aspects of these myths. So you'll see gods that exist as things like the sea, or the stars or the moon or the sun. So you have these various personifications of the creation itself that become the gods. Now that's seen in some of the myths that we talked about, and then some of the implications downstream of these, where a lot of the gods are expounded upon in other myths that come out of these other worldviews. And fifth, the floods are almost always used to reintroduce chaos into the world by gods of mischief, if you will. And this is again that struggle of gods against chaos, gods fighting other gods. So the floods themselves are not used in any other way other than to kind of bring it back to that primal state from which the earth and the world emerged from. So floods is all about reintroducing chaos into the world. And so these are some of the common traits that we see in these ancient myths. We've looked at 7 other creation myths from ancient Near Eastern cultures. We've looked at from Egypt, Canaan, and Mesopotamia, and we saw the traits that those have in common. But how is Genesis 1 through 11 different? What makes it stand out from all these other myths? And it's having done the historiography of these other creation myths against Genesis 1, and we've already highlighted some of the differences with particular myths. I think there's a lot of bold claims that the Hebrews were making in Genesis 1 through 11 that almost serve as a polemic against all the other worldviews from that date, time, and age. And it really does set up the God of the Bible as a supreme and an in-charge God. And so let's walk through some of these differences so you can see how the statements made in Genesis 1 through 11 really do exalt the God of the Bible above all. First thing we see is there is no theogony. Remember, theogony is the creation of gods. The opening chapter of the Bible and the opening verse of the Bible starts with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." There is no creation account of God himself. We strictly see God exists and he brings about the heavens and the earth. And then we see in the later verses that God brings about the creation of the world. The creation of the world, though, is significant because it starts with God over the water. This is a position of authority. Remember, in the other myths, we saw most of those myths having gods emerge from the water, or the gods, the primal gods at least, being personified in the water. God is in the opening verses of Genesis 1, hovering over the water. His face is over the surface of the deep. He is there at the primal state, and it is in that moment we see God being over it. And now in the ancient Near East, being over somebody or being over something gave it a position of authority. And this is significant to say that God is not in the water, God is not from the water, rather God is over the water. He is the one that is in charge of the water, and the water is under his authority, not God struggling against it to obtain authority. It's already under his command. Third, God divides the primordial water to create the heavens and earth with a word. There is no struggle against chaos here. He simply speaks and the waters divide and the heaven appears, and then he speaks, and then from the lower waters that he divided appear the land. And it's these creative acts of speech acts that God creates the world. You don't see God struggling against the chaos. You don't see God struggling against other gods. He simply just speaks and things happen. There is no conflict here. As we already saw, it's already under his authority, and so there's no struggle. It's just simply God speaking and things begin to happen. And that's pretty significant because it really does speak to the power of God over the primal state and the world itself. Third or fourth, we see God creates the heavens and all living things, and none of these things are personified. In other words, when God creates the heavens, he names it heaven. He creates the earth and names it earth. He creates living things and he calls them the flying things and plants and so on. Giving these things names gives them purpose, but none of these things are created as personal entities. None of these things are gods themselves. In other mythologies, we saw that the heavens might be a god, or you might have a sun god or a moon god, or some things on the earth, like the sea itself, might be a god. But in the Genesis 1 through 11 account, none of these things are personified as deities of any kind. They're really just strictly entities that aren't personified, that have no qualities of a human or a god at all. They're really just created things and nothing more than that. And fourth, man is created in the image of God. Now, this is a fairly significant point here because most all other creations of the gods creating man put man in a subject, in some kind of subjugation to the gods. Being created in the image of God is significant because it means that man is not in a slave relationship to God. Rather, what we see in the opening chapters of Genesis is God in relationship with man. He communes with man. He walks with man in the garden. He spends time with man, and that original state is what man has with God. It's a image bearer of God that is in relationship with God in the way that a friend would have with another friend. It's not a necessarily a peer relationship, but it is certainly a relationship that is not one of subjugation, rather one of intimacy and love, and that is really stands apart from other creation myths that we see man being created as slaves, and then other myths talking about how man rebels against the gods and so on. And that's a really significant point to make because it really does give us an insight into the nature of the men in the Hebrew worldview as opposed to all these other worldviews of that day and age. And lastly, the struggle in these opening accounts in Genesis is really not God against chaos, as we've already mentioned, or God against other God. The struggle that's introduced is a struggle against sin. And what we see is not an explanation of how the world came to be as a struggle of gods and you have hero gods. Rather, you see the opening chapters of Genesis really explain the struggle against sin and the origins of sin in the world. So we see Adam and Eve in the fall, and then we see the judgment that God has there as they go out of Eden, and they see the struggle between the lines of Cain and Abel, or no, sorry, the godly lines that flow from Adam and Eve, and the ungodly line that flowed from Adam and Eve, and that struggle. Then you end up with Noah, where the world is utterly corrupt from sin, and God uses flood waters as a judgment against sin, not as an instrument of reintroducing chaos into the world. So the struggle in all of the opening chapters of Genesis is not a struggle against the chaos; it's really a struggle against sin, and that really makes these accounts in Genesis really unique among the ancient Near East, because the struggle here is not one of the cosmos. Rather, it's internal. It's in the hearts of men, and the story as it plays out from Genesis to Jesus is really about God trying to reclaim the relationship that he sets up in the early chapters of Genesis. And it's a story about God trying to struggle against the sin that's in the world. And there's a struggle for the hearts of men, really, that God is having to judge the hearts of men, but yet in his love is trying to extend mercy to men as well. And then you get to the New Testament with Jesus, and there we see Jesus come on the scene, the incarnation of God himself, where he deals with sin and he brings about the struggle on the cross, where he becomes the sacrifice that God demands for sin, and that struggle is resolved in that aspect, and see God victorious in the resurrection of Jesus. And then we get to the end of the story, where ultimately there's a recreation, and there is a general resurrection, and those who have faith in Jesus have our eternal life, and they go to be a part with God, and the all those who have no faith are condemned. So it's a story of sin and the struggle with sin that we see in the Bible that stands out as a uniqueness among all other worldviews that are in the Hebrew context and space that we see in the ancient Near East. Now, it's important to remember that when the readers were beginning to understand this, that they didn't just see this as a foundational theology, but it was making some bold statements about the world and how it worked in light of all these other prevailing worldviews. And when they would read this, it would be like, oh, this God is genuinely powerful over all gods. Not only that, his struggle is not against chaos. He is supreme over chaos. Rather, his struggle is not against other gods. His struggle is against the moral evil in the world, and he really is wants to do something about the moral evil, and really wants to see men repent and come to repentance and have that relationship that was established in the opening chapters of Genesis and restored, and that perfect order that God brought about in creation is really kind of the ultimate end game that we see revealed in Revelation. And so over the next several weeks, we're going to be covering a lot of these events as they unfold through all of history, ultimately ending in Revelation, and talking about why these things are important and what it is and how it fills in some of the details, as we talk about, like as I said in the early slides, that 99% of the Bible that covers the rest of the history of the Bible, and talk about it from that angle.